Therapy doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in the world, in culture, in systems, in skin. And if we don't name that, we miss the whole point of healing. I am Tracy Gantlin-Monroy, and this is Beyond the Spot. Beyond the Spot, Decolonizing Healing One Brain at a Time, is a podcast that weaves, my first love, of course, brain spotting, and somatic informed modalities with embodied healing, cultural consciousness, and real talk about trauma, resilience, and recovery. Hosted by Tracy Gantlin-Monroy, a licensed professional counselor, spiritual healer, and the first Black female brain spotting trainer in the world. Each episode dares to dismantle mental health myths, uplift lived experiences, and restore collective wisdom. One conversation at a time. Beyond the Spot podcast is for educational purposes and is not therapy. Please reach out to licensed medical and mental health professionals. Thank you. Welcome to Beyond the Spot. In this episode, I want to speak to what often goes unnamed in clinical spaces. Whiteness, power, bias, the myth of neutrality. Today we're going there, into the unspoken truths about race, power, and whiteness in therapy. Because neutrality is a myth. While therapy is often described as objective or safe, many of us have sat in rooms where our culture was overlooked. Our rage was pathologized. Our softness misunderstood. We're going to talk about what neutrality really means. And is it possible? Even from a neuroscience perspective. And who does neutrality tend to serve? To be fair, I'm working from the operational definition of whiteness, which asserts whiteness and white people are not the same. I'm not talking about individual white people. I'm talking about a social construct, a structure, an ideology that has been embedded into dominant culture, often without being named. Whiteness is a system that centers white experience, values, and ways of being as universal, while treating everything else as deviation, deficiency, or culture with a lowercase c. It shows up in therapy as neutrality, in schools as standard English, and in medicine as noncompliance. It defines what's considered professional, credible, and safe, often without being visible. Whiteness protects itself by calling its norms objective. It says things like, I don't see color, while building systems that erase identity at the root. It's supremacy masked as structure. It's dominance disguised as order. And unless we name it directly, We unconsciously replicate it, even in the therapy room. I'll even go right here as a licensed professional counselor. The APA, which is the acronym for the American Psychological Association, that's tied to psychologists, and it is a trendsetter in the mental health field in the US. It was not until October of 2021, do the math. This is 2025. It was not until October of 2021 that the American Psychological Association posted an apology to Black folks and folks of color. Look it up. Look up APA apology to Black folks and folks of color. That'll give you a deeper understanding about where I'm coming from. So it's not like I'm just jumping out here just saying something. No, this is a problem. Okay? Because there are so many myths of neutrality, and I just find it prudent to address it. There are even statements that align with this idea of neutrality that certainly does not exist. Okay? Surely you've heard, I don't see color. That's not neutrality, that's avoidance. How about this one? I treat everyone the same. That's not equity. That's erasure for the people in the back of the room. Certainly you've heard this. I certainly have. Therapy is a safe space. But for who? Because according to Dr. Daryl Sue and the gang, as I call them, they're a group of people that come together and they do quite a bit of work around cultural competency in the mental health field. Dr. Sue is actually Asian American, and I really respect his work. Okay. And it talks about the percentage of persons of color who are actually traumatized in session by mental health professionals. Anything I say on Beyond the Spot, please research it because I'm standing 10 toes down just like that. Okay. And I want to be clear here. Neutrality is not spiritual. It's not clinical. It's avoidance dressed in professionalism. And people feel it. Our clients feel it, especially if they're used to being unseen in clinical spaces. Neutrality is often about the therapist's comfort, not the client's healing. Silence can feel violent when someone is bringing their whole complex self into the room. Clinicians who avoid race, power, or identity aren't neutral, they're merely unavailable. We have got to be more honest. Neutrality might feel grounding for the therapist, but it can feel like erasure to and for the client. We're not asking, I'm certainly not asking any therapist to be perfect because I certainly am not. I am simply holding myself to a mandate and inviting my colleagues to do the same. And that is simply for us all to be present. It is a fact that neutrality is often code for centering whiteness and silencing discomfort. Talk to some Black and brown people and just ask them, have they ever found the silence in therapy rooms to be violent for them? When clinicians refuse to name race, culture, or power, they're not being neutral, they're actually being complicit. It takes me back to those times from civil rights and even more recently with George Floyd and how dominant cultured white co conspirators and allies were literally out there on the battlefield with the people. And during some of those um, peaceful protest. And when the police and such would come to the areas, I found it fascinating how the dominant cultured white people who were absolutely co conspirators and allies would shift to the front of the line because it just seemed like even public safety was desensitized to melanated skin. I'm just saying, we all kind of witnessed it as a community, a global community. And so we have got to name what it is. Neutrality can actually be a trauma response, especially among clinicians socialized to avoid conflict or confrontation. And this becomes an invitation, especially for my colleagues that identify as dominant cultured white therapists, to explore how your own desire to stay neutral may be a way to stay comfortable and less than accountable. Because silence around race upholds supremacy. Even when it comes to those tools that set the standard, how about the DSM bias and the weaponization of diagnoses? Fact, there was a time when homosexuality was listed in the DSM as maladaptive and a disorder. I'm not making that up. We have got to name, whether we're talking about race, whether we're talking about culture, whether we're talking about whatever type of power. The LGBTQIA plus community is a marginalized community. The LGBTQIA plus community is seen as an oppressed group juxtaposed to the dominant cultured normative, which has the privilege dealing with this idea of sex, being born female or male and identifying as such. How about even when we talk about gender? Same category, male, female, gender, assigned at birth, male or female, right? Because there's always this conversation between gender and sex. Okay. And so when I talk about the LGBTQIA plus community, that is an oppressed community. Okay. Even now, I'm in Georgia. And so there's been this big thing about providing gender affirming care. I'm not going to go there because I don't want to get into politics, but just know there's been a lot of changes, especially since the rights of women have been taken away from us. When I talk about supremacy, when I talk about domination, I need you all to start expanding yourselves beyond race. Because as I'm coming from an intersectionality and social justice frame, race is only one axis. There's so many things involved with that when we talk about domination and oppression. Here are some real life examples that might also sound familiar. How about this idea or stigma or trope when it comes to Black women labeled as angry instead of the noticing of Black women being clear and or attuned. How about cultural expressions, traditions mistaken for disorders? Yeah. What about this idea of cultural grief mistaken for clinical depression? It's not uncommon for marginalized persons, especially by race and culture, to engage code switching as the price of being understood. That's a problem. It is also common fare for religious or spiritual identity to be dismissed as magical thinking. Let's go here. Eye contact norms misinterpreted as avoidance or disrespect. Yeah, I'm going to tell you right now, anybody sitting with a therapist, and I'm talking to my colleagues, bottom line, if your therapist is not set themselves aside to do their own work, any therapist not doing their own work is problematic. I said it, I do my own work. I got people I sit with. It's necessary. The fact of the matter is this: whiteness isn't always visible, but it's always present. Some of us aren't unwell, especially as marginalized persons of race, culture, and power. We're simply reacting to being unseen. When your clinician, when your therapist, when your helping professional avoids race, they're avoiding you. Uh huh. Microaggressions in therapy are still aggressions nonetheless, and they land in the body. Be mindful. The body truly does keep the score. You can't co regulate with someone who refuses to acknowledge your lived reality, your lived experience. It's just not possible. There is no connection, there's no ground by which to attune, relationally nor neurobiologically. When we erase the lived reality or lived experience of another human being, that's a problem. But there is hope because liberatory therapy asks us to go deeper. You know, when I think about this liberatory therapy, it takes me right back to liberation theology when I was in seminary. And I found it quite interesting to read the works of Paulo Freire from Brazil and so many others, right? This kind of gives me a beautiful flashback of knowing to reference here. So I'm not surprised I'm having this conversation with you. This is not my first rodeo, but I am committed to the social justice access, the social justice idea of access, because I do have the hope that someday, as a result of equity, love, grace, kindness, and inclusion, that there will not be a need for affinity groups such as BIPOC, such as persons of color. I do hold that faith. That's the underpinning of my work. Yeah. So, with that, when we talk about decolonized and liberatory therapy and healing, It does require us to go deeper. And some of the ways we can do that is to practice cultural humility, not just cultural competence, to self regulate our discomfort rather than bypass it. It literally requires the therapist who can self regulate and decenter themselves. And even as I think about that decentering, I just got back Monday from Poland. I went to attend a neuroscience and trauma training with Dr. Damir del Monte, and it was beautiful. And like, there was so much that happened in Warsaw, Poland, in my experience. But when I think about this idea of decentering, one of the transitions I quickly made was understanding that I had to decenter my Americanness. Poland is in Europe. And they tend to do things in the Europe fashion, which I actually enjoy and like and adore. My first time in Europe, I was 13 years old and I haven't stopped visiting. Thanks to my parents who allowed me to have that exposure and that experience. I knew the world was bigger than where I lived. And I'm so grateful for that because that has everything to do with the embodiment of the call on my life. And this is part of it because, even though I'm talking about decolonization, liberatory therapy, even though my first kiss in life was a white boy, even though I have a multicultural son, even though I was married to a white Hispanic for 20 years, all the things, all I'm saying here, because I don't need to give you a resume, but I need you to understand that being reared with socioeconomic privilege allowed me to be in spaces and in rooms. Okay. And it socialized me differently that calibrated my nervous system to be able to have challenging conversations lovingly with different than me. What am I saying here? For the most part, my trauma came at the hands of people that looked like me, girls who bullied me, who had this idea because I was different. Of course, I didn't know what my difference was at that time, which was socioeconomic. I was raised in a two-parent household, all the things. But where I'm going with this is when I was being bullied and mistreated by people that looked like me, it was the dominant cultured white teachers and administrators and those in community that protected me. I was socialized to different early on in my life. My parents were not proponents of issue with different than us. In fact, I'll say this, my dad is late. Had he been on this side of living, there's just some things you would not hear out my mouth in my effort to protect my dad. Yes, I'm daddy's girl. That's right. My daddy had a penchant for getting money. And I always found it interesting that he had such beautiful relationships with people who had access, people who were in power, and they were genuine relationships. Because I don't know if you recognize it or not. People move differently when there is relationship on the table, when there is commonality and common ground, connection. I'm just saying, right? So, with that, this work is important to me, okay? Because when I start talking about decolonization, healing, one brain at a time, It is important when we think about liberatory therapy and healing, we got to use models that honor spirit, ancestry, and embodied truth. The space must be made for spirituality, ancestral wisdom, and body led narratives. If a person is disallowed from their truth of their narrative, of their story, of their lived experience, they cannot heal. Decolonized therapy isn't a trend, my friend. It's literally a lens. You cannot heal systemic harm without naming the system. If a client's body braces walking into a session, that's not regulation, it's survival. Let me say that again. It's survival. Liberation means the therapist holds the discomfort, not the client. And let me just give you this one. Homeostasis and or balance or stability is not healing. I'm talking about healing here. Homeostasis, regulation, stability is on the continuum towards healing. And there's no way to access healing and transformation without going through sadness and or grief. That's on that continuum as well. So when whiteness becomes the default, anything outside of it gets labeled too much, too angry, too emotional, too spiritual, too resistant. I've seen it. I've lived it. Decolonized therapy isn't a modality, it's a mindset. You cannot help someone heal from systemic harm if you refuse to name the system. Healing in and of itself requires truth, and truth is never neutral. If your body tenses absolutely every time you walk into the room, that's not safety. It's survival. So many of us have lived our lives year upon year seeking safety in survival mode. Liberatory therapy asks the therapist to be uncomfortable so the client doesn't have to carry that entire burden of translation. Fact. It is the therapist's role and job to dismantle the power dynamic in the space. Cultural attunement is not optional, it's beyond ethical. I started mentioning a little bit about my visit to Warsaw, Poland, right? And returning from that neuroscience, trauma, and psychotherapy training with Doctor, and I don't say that lightly, Damir del Monte, I want to share some of what I learned because it's appropriate for this conversation. The nervous system doesn't operate in abstraction. It operates in response to perception. Our brain is not wired for truth. It is wired for protection, survival. It filters experience through perception, prediction, and previous pattern. The brain isn't wired for truth. I can't say that enough. It is absolutely wired for protection. Our systems make predictions based on past experience, not facts. Trauma then shifts the perception, which shifts everything else, whether it be safety, memory, and or connection. Trauma alters perception. It changes what feels safe, what gets remembered, and how the body responds in the present. When I talk about prediction eras, and Dr. Damir spoke quite a bit about this, and it was just all so fascinating. So, the brain, in and of itself, is a prediction generator. And so I'm coming from the place with prediction eras that has to do when the brain receives new input that challenges its old expectations. And these are the entry points for transformation and healing. I'm just saying. And so, what that means in therapy is actually this: psychotherapy, when attuned and embodied, creates a new experience. It interrupts the old loop of fear, shame, or even collapse. This is how our stories, this is how narratives begin to change. The brain adapts to new input when it is safe, seen, and not rushed. Healing takes time, y'all. We don't overwrite trauma by logic. We interrupt it with presence and novelty and brain spotting and all the things. Because therapy isn't just talking, it's offering a new experience. The brain forms new pathways when a client encounters something unexpected and safe. These prediction eras allow the nervous system to soften, to thaw, to unlearn and rewire. This is why attunement matters. This is why silence, presence, and co regulation heals. There's a reason I am a brain spotting girl at the root, because the more I expand, the more I explore, the more I deepen my learning and my neuro experiences as a clinician, it helps me gain a deeper awareness and understanding of where healing lies in the system. And I want to say this, because for those of you who know, you know, this episode isn't about shaming dominant cultured white clinicians. It's actually about calling in integrity. Because if you're serving diverse clients, neutrality isn't enough. You require and need awareness, humility, and a commitment to change. And for all of my dominant cultured white colleagues listening, seriously, I invite you to examine where you've been silent. Not to feel guilty, but to create more resonance, because your healing matters too. We're in this together. And many of you have attended my training I developed, Brain Spotting, Intersectionality, and Social Justice. We literally have these dialogues and conversations and communications in an inclusive environment. I can't tell you how much healing I have received as a result of this particular training. No, and I still talk about stuff that happened in those trainings that just brings me so much hope and joy. Healing is relational. If the space isn't built to include culture, power, and embodiment, then it isn't built to truly heal. Yeah, yeah. One of the things that stuck out to me from Dr. Damir del Monte's teaching and the way he did it, he kind of broke down three things for me. This is based on Damir's framework, and it deals with the hardwired world, which has to do with primal brain structures and survival based responses. Then there's the pattern world, which has to do with the learned associations, habits, trauma encoding or learned trauma. And then there's this mental self world that deals with your story, identity, language, narrative, and meaning making. And I give credit to Dr. Demir about this idea of the worlds because as he was teaching about it, and I am not a neuroscientist, I just happen to be a clinician leaning into those things that I have found helpful for healing and regulation and expansion. Yeah. So I'm leaning into the tools required in my toolbox to support community. That's the goal. That's what I do every day. The way Dr. Demir taught the neuroscience and trauma and psychotherapy application was such a beautiful bridge to give awareness. And there's something that he said that was like an ashe to me. It was like a nod to me because it's something I've always known when we start talking about neutrality and being neutral. Here's the fact of the matter. Ding, 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 ding. None of us are neutral. Absolutely not a one of us have a neutral brain. Why? We all come with our bias of our own lived experience. In fact, science shows that there's an impact even on the embryo in utero before we even come on this side of living connected to the birthing person. There was something so fascinating while I was in Poland at the training, and it was something about when the mother rubbed her skin on her face or touched her lip, how the baby in utero, how the embryo literally touched their own lip. It's pretty wild. I was fascinated by what that looks like. And even talking about the prenatal stress, how that impact babies, and becoming more intimate with the insula. That insula is a really big deal. So for any of you clinicians listening to me, go check out that insula and see what's up. We don't hear enough about the insula. But I do want to say this to bring it back in. When we say therapy is neutral, but ignore how all three of these worlds are shaped by culture and lived experience, we're missing the real architecture of healing. Safety, change, and growth don't happen in abstract. They happen in perception. And perception is always embodied and informed by context. And I'm pausing there with intentionality because to understand neuroscience has supported me with understanding the journey towards transformation and healing. And I want to call you to a place of reflection. It's simply an invitation at this point in my broadcast. Have you ever felt unseen in therapy? What was missing? What did neutrality look like in the rooms you've entered, whether as a client, a patient, or a clinician? especially if you're a person of color. And you know what? No, I'll leave that right there. What would it feel like to be fully seen in your complexity? If you're a clinician, where have you stayed neutral when you should have leaned in? And again, for clinical listeners, where might staying neutral have cost someone their truth? What new experience could help shift an old pattern in your nervous system? Where might a new experience shift an old prediction in your nervous system? Therapy isn't neutral. It never was. And when we start naming the systems that shape our wounds, that shape our pain, we make space for real repair. If your therapist can't hold your culture, your rage, your softness, they can't hold your healing either. Let's name what's real. Thank you for being here. If this episode spoke truth to your nervous system, as always, share it, leave a review, and keep the conversation going. You're always welcome to work with me or train in brain spotting through culturally attuned lens. Check me out. Look me up. This is Beyond the Spot, decolonizing healing one brain at a time. And I am your host, Tracy Gantlin-Monroy. And you deserve to be seen in full color. If today's episode resonated with your nervous system or your spirit, share it with someone who's still unlearning and reach out to me. My website is gracecommunitycounseling.com. You can reach me on Instagram at Monroy LPC. That is MONROY LPC. Also, I have offerings from retreats to brain spotting trainings to workshops, you name it. And I am also a speaker. So if you ever need a speaker with my skill set, look me up. Give me a call. Let's see what can happen. And absolutely for you clinicians and adjacent body healers, feel free to reach out and attend a brain spotting training. We have trainings all the time. Thank you.